Have you ever truly felt alone in your own home? Not just by yourself, but alone. That chilling, gnawing sensation that permeates the very air around you, making every shadow seem to writhe, every creak in the floorboards a whisper meant only for your ears. It's a primal fear, one that burrows deep into the ancient parts of our brains, reminding us that the sanctuary we build around ourselves is, at its core, a fragile illusion. We lock our doors, arm our systems, and draw our blinds, creating a fortress against the unknown. Yet, what happens when the unknown isn't outside, clawing at the window, but already inside, nestled in the deepest recesses of your presumed safety? What happens when the quiet hum of your refrigerator becomes a low growl, when the familiar shapes of your furniture seem to subtly shift their contours in your peripheral vision? This isn't about intruders breaking in. It's about the unsettling realization that sometimes, the most profound and soul-shattering horror doesn't come from external forces. It originates from within the very walls that promise solace, from the quiet corners of your own home, from the solitude that stretches into an oppressive, suffocating void. It's a horror that preys on the mind, twisting reality into a grotesque parody of itself, leaving you to question not just what you see but what you know to be true. This is the kind of fear that lingers long after the lights are on, long after the morning sun streams through the windows, because it's a fear that has seeped into the fabric of your being, a permanent stain on your perception of safety. It's the kind of fear that transforms the mundane into the menacing, turning the familiar into the utterly alien. And in the vast, sprawling landscapes of places like California, where golden dreams often mask darker truths, these unsettling narratives aren't just confined to the realm of fiction. They whisper through the canyons, echo in the empty homes nestled in quiet suburbs, and seep into the very foundations of the Sunshine State. Here, amidst the palm trees and the glittering lights, a different kind of darkness can take root, one that thrives on isolation and the slow, insidious erosion of sanity. It's a darkness that proves time and again that the greatest horrors often don't require elaborate plots or monstrous creatures. They simply require you to be home, and alone. And that, in itself, is often more than enough. The silence becomes a character, the shadows gain substance, and the very air around you thickens with an unspoken dread. This isn't just about jump scares or fleeting moments of terror. It's about the slow, agonizing descent into a psychological labyrinth where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur beyond recognition. It's about the home becoming a prison, a cage where the bars are woven from your own escalating fear, and the only other inhabitant is the creeping, suffocating sense of something else. Imagine this. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The last rays of light fade, and an unnatural darkness begins to seep into every corner of your home. The silence that descends isn't peaceful. It's the kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with unspoken things, pressing in on you from all sides. You're alone. Utterly, completely alone. And that's when the challenge truly begins. When you're home alone, the lines between what's real and what your mind conjures can blur with terrifying ease. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of leaves outside, every indiscernible whisper of wind can become a potential threat, magnified by the echoing emptiness of your surroundings. Your own imagination, usually a source of comfort or creativity, becomes a weapon against you, populating the shadows with malevolent forms, turning familiar sounds into sinister portents. The problem isn't just the potential for a physical intruder. It's the psychological invasion that accompanies extreme solitude. It's the insidious whispers of paranoia, the cold grip of anxiety that tightens around your chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. You start to second-guess yourself, checking locks multiple times, peering into darkened rooms with a flashlight, only to find nothing. Or do you? The terror lies in the ambiguity, in the nagging doubt that perhaps you missed something, that a pair of unseen eyes is watching you from the darkest corner of the living room, or that a presence you can't quite define is just beyond your line of sight. Sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. Every shadow seems to deepen, every mundane object takes on a sinister new form. The coat rack in the hall transforms into a hunched figure, the pile of laundry on the chair becomes a watchful entity. Your own home, the place you've cultivated as your sanctuary, slowly but surely morphs into a labyrinth of dread, a psychological trap where escape seems impossible. This isn't just a fleeting moment of unease, it's a slow, agonizing process of psychological erosion, where your sense of reality is chipped away piece by piece, leaving you exposed and vulnerable. And in the quiet, unassuming suburbs of California, where every house looks the same and every street seems to hum with the quiet contentment of middle-class life, these stories take on an even more chilling resonance. Because if it can happen there, in the picture-perfect tranquility, It can happen anywhere. It can happen to you. The veneer of safety is thin, easily fractured by the smallest anomaly, the slightest deviation from the expected. And once that crack appears, the darkness can seep in, slow and inexorable, until it consumes everything, leaving behind only the chilling echo of what once was. The air grows heavy, the very walls seem to close in, and the silence, once a comfort, becomes a deafening roar in your ears, filled with the unspoken dread of something being profoundly, utterly wrong. Let's delve into these chilling tales, starting with the quiet, unassuming life of Sarah, a freelance graphic designer living in a modest bungalow in Pasadena. Sarah cherished her solitude. Her work often kept her up late, the glow of her monitor painting her face in the quiet hours of the night. Her home was her haven, a place of creative sanctuary. The first anomaly was subtle, almost imperceptible. A book, left open on her coffee table, would be found closed the next morning. A light she swore she'd turned off would be on. Small things easily dismissed as forgetfulness, or perhaps the whimsical quirks of an old house. She laughed them off, attributing them to fatigue or a faulty memory. But then the whispers began. Soft, indistinct, like static on an old radio just at the edge of her hearing. They would emerge from the deepest parts of the house, from the forgotten corners of the attic, or the damp chill of the unused basement. She'd pause her music, strain her ears, but the moment she focused, they'd vanish, leaving only the oppressive silence. The air in her home began to feel heavier, colder, even on the warmest California nights. A strange, metallic tang like old blood and rust would occasionally waft through the halls, only to dissipate moments later. Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her skin prickling with an inexplicable dread. Sleep became fragmented, haunted by vivid, disturbing dreams that would vanish upon waking, leaving only a lingering sense of terror. She started leaving lights on even during the day, a subtle attempt to push back against the creeping darkness. She tried to rationalize it all, stress from work, too much caffeine, a vivid imagination running wild. But deep down, a cold certainty began to form. She wasn't alone. And whatever was with her, it wasn't friendly. The house, once a comfort, was slowly transforming into something alien, something malevolent. The familiar sounds of her old home, the groaning of the pipes, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, twisted into sinister echoes of an unseen presence. She started meticulously checking every room before bed, a ritual born of increasing paranoia. She'd even set up small, innocuous items, a book on its spine, a pen precariously balanced, to see if they moved. And they did. Not always, not dramatically, but enough to confirm her horrifying suspicion. The feeling of being watched was constant, a pervasive chill that settled deep in her bones. She started talking to herself, half in defiance, half in a desperate attempt to fill the oppressive silence with her own voice. But even her voice felt swallowed, absorbed by the hungry quiet of the house. The plants she kept thriving in her living room began to wither, their leaves curling and browning despite her diligent care. A subtle, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards at odd hours, a vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth, or perhaps from within the very foundation of her home. Her reflection in the darkened windows seemed to linger for a fraction of a second too long, her own eyes appearing wider, darker, more desperate than she remembered. She would often find herself staring into corners, convinced she saw a flicker, a fleeting shift in the shadows that wasn't just her imagination playing tricks. The scent of ozone, sharp and acrid, would occasionally fill certain rooms, especially after one of the more pronounced disturbances. This wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a sensory assault, an undeniable erosion of her reality, pushing her closer to a precipice she couldn't quite comprehend. Then there's the case of Mark and Emily, a young couple who moved into a beautifully restored Victorian house in San Francisco. They were thrilled with their new home, full of historic charm and elegant details. But the charm quickly faded into something far more sinister. The first sign was the cold spot in the master bedroom. An inexplicable pocket of freezing air, even when the rest of the house was warm. It wasn't drafts, it was a localized, intense chill that clung to a specific area of the room, often moving like an unseen entity drifting through their space. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, like tiny claws on plaster coming from inside the walls. They dismissed it as rodents setting traps but finding nothing. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, evolving into a rhythmic scraping, almost like something dragging itself through the confines of the house's structure. It would stop the moment they approached the wall, only to resume moments after they left. Emily, being more sensitive, began to feel a constant, suffocating pressure. as if someone was pressing down on her chest. She complained of feeling watched, of waking up in the dead of night to the sensation of eyes on her, only to find Mark sound asleep beside her. Mark, ever the pragmatist, tried to explain it away with logical reasons. Old house noises, settling foundations, stress. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that permeated their home. Objects would move. Not just small items but heavy pieces of furniture. A dining chair would be found pulled away from the table, a large potted plant inexplicably shifted across the room. One morning they awoke to find all the kitchen cabinet doors flung wide open, as if in a violent rage, every single dish shattered on the floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no logical explanation. The house felt alive but not in a comforting lived-in way. It felt like it was actively hostile, slowly but surely driving them to the brink. They started arguing more, their nerves frayed by the constant, inexplicable disturbances. The laughter and joy that had filled their new home were replaced by an icy tension, a palpable fear that clung to every shadow. The air grew stale, heavy with an unseen presence, even with windows open. They began to sleep in shifts, one watching while the other rested, a desperate attempt to find some semblance of peace. The scratching now sounded like a low, guttural growl, emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. They found strange, dark stains appearing on the antique wallpaper, stains that seemed to writhe and expand in the dim light, almost like ink bleeding into the paper. The dreams they both experienced became shared, horrifying visions of a shadowy figure with long, grasping limbs, lurking in the corners of their peripheral vision, always just out of reach, always watching. They felt trapped, their beautiful Victorian dream transforming into a suffocating nightmare, a prison built of their own escalating terror and the undeniable, malevolent force that now claimed their home. The chilling realization slowly dawned on them. This wasn't just an old house with a few quirks. This was a living, breathing entity, one that reveled in their fear, feeding off their sanity, and it was systematically dismantling their lives, piece by agonizing piece. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with unspoken threats, with the echo of their own increasingly frantic heartbeats, and with the chilling certainty that they were being hunted within their own four walls. Now let's turn to the most chilling moments. For Sarah in Pasadena, the climax arrived on a night when the whispers coalesced into a distinct, guttural rasp, a sound that seemed to originate from directly behind her. She was working late, engrossed in a design, when the temperature in her small home plummeted to an unbearable cold, a biting raw chill that seeped into her bones. The air grew thick, heavy, with the metallic scent intensifying to an almost nauseating degree. Then the whispers. They weren't just indistinct anymore. They were coalescing, forming words, though she couldn't quite make them out. It was a rapid, overlapping cacophony of hushed, malevolent voices, swirling around her, seeming to emanate from the very air itself. Her screen flickered, the images on it distorting into grotesque caricatures of her own face. And then the ultimate terror. Her chair, without a sound, was slowly, deliberately pulled backward from her desk. She wasn't touching it. No one was. She scrambled forward, heart hammering against her ribs, spinning around to face the empty space behind her. The cold was overwhelming, but it was the profound sense of presence that truly broke her. She felt it, a formless, hulking mass of pure malevolence, towering over her, its unseen gaze burning into her very soul. The whispering intensified, becoming a deafening roar in her mind, a chaotic symphony of pure, unadulterated hatred. She couldn't see anything but she felt it. A hand, cold and spectral, brushed against her hair, sending a jolt of ice through her entire body. It was then, in that moment of absolute, suffocating terror, that she knew, this wasn't her imagination. This wasn't stress. This was something ancient, something evil, and it had finally, irrevocably made itself known. She screamed, a raw, primal sound ripped from the depths of her being, and fled the house, leaving everything behind, the memory of that invisible touch and indelible burn on her scalp. For Mark and Emily in San Francisco, their breaking point came one terrifying night when the scratching in the walls escalated into a violent, guttural thrashing. They were awoken by a deafening crash from the kitchen. They rushed in, flashlights in hand, to find not just shattered dishes, but the refrigerator, a heavy built-in unit, had been ripped from its moorings, lying on its side, leaking water and coolant onto the floor. The entire room smelled of ozone and something rotten like old meat. But the real horror wasn't the destruction. It was the movement. As they stood there, paralyzed with shock, the floorboards beneath their feet began to heave and buckle. The walls groaned and dark, viscous stains began to ooze from the plaster, slowly forming grotesque, skeletal patterns. And then, from the depths of the overturned refrigerator, came a low, rasping breath, a sound that was too wet, too deep, too alive to be anything natural. Emily shrieked, pointing to the dark, churning liquid spreading from the broken appliance. In its center, something was beginning to stir, something large. A shape, indistinct and shifting, began to rise from the shadowy depths, its form fluid and amorphous, but undeniably present, its movements suggesting an impossibly large, predatory entity struggling to emerge. Mark, in a surge of desperate adrenaline, grabbed Emily and pulled her toward the front door, the very air in the kitchen now thick with a palpable malevolence. As they stumbled out into the street, the Victorian house behind them seemed to let out a collective groan, a sound of immense, predatory satisfaction, as if it had finally consumed what it had been hungering for. The windows on the upper floors seemed to darken, not with shadow but with an internal, consuming void. The very foundation of the home shuddered, and a faint, high-pitched keening sound, like a banshee's wail, echoed from within, a sound that promised not just death but eternal, screaming torment. The horror wasn't just that they were seeing something impossible, it was the realization that this house, this beautiful, historic home, was not just haunted but alive, and it had chosen them for its gruesome feast. The air outside felt thin and cold compared to the suffocating presence they had just escaped. They kept running, the screams of the house echoing in their minds, knowing that their lives, their sanity, had been irrevocably shattered by what they had witnessed. The lingering image of that shifting, amorphous mass rising from the refrigerator, its form still undefined but its malevolent intent screamingly clear, would forever haunt their waking hours and poison their dreams. The final and perhaps most insidious story belongs to David, a reclusive writer who moved into a remote cabin deep in the Redwood National Park. He sought solitude, inspiration, and escape from the relentless noise of urban life. He found something far worse. His initial weeks were idyllic. The majestic silence of the ancient forest, the crisp, clean air, the rustling of leaves, it was everything he craved. But then the silence deepened. It became unnatural, profound, as if the very air absorbed all sound, leaving only a vacuum of oppressive quiet. The forest, once a source of peace, began to feel like a watchful, malevolent entity. The trees, ancient and towering, seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. He'd hear faint whispers carried on the wind, just out of earshot, indistinct but chillingly persistent, like a choir of ancient, aggrieved spirits. He found himself unable to write, his thoughts tangled in a web of mounting unease. The shadows in his cabin grew longer, darker, moving with a subtle independence from the natural light, seeming to writhe and shift in his peripheral vision. His reflection in the windows would sometimes appear distorted, elongated, its eyes too wide, too vacant. He dismissed it as optical illusions, the tricks of the light in the dense woods. But the feeling of being watched was constant, a cold, pervasive dread that settled deep in his bones. He started noticing anomalies in the forest itself. Trees that weren't there the day before, or familiar landmarks subtly shifted. Paths he walked daily would inexplicably diverge, leading him into deeper, more unsettling parts of the woods, only to lead him back to his cabin from an impossible direction. The air around him would grow heavy, the scent of damp earth and decay intensifying, even in dry weather. He began to find strange carvings on the bark of trees near his cabin, intricate, almost geometric symbols that pulsed with an unsettling energy, seeming to shift and morph as he stared at them. They felt ancient, primordial, imbued with a malevolence that transcended human understanding. He started sleeping less, plagued by nightmares of being endlessly pursued through an impossibly dense, sentient forest, its branches grasping, its roots coiling around him, its very essence attempting to suffocate him. The cabin, his supposed sanctuary, began to feel like a cage, the ancient forest pressing in on all sides, its silence no longer peaceful but deafening, filled with unspoken threats. He began to hear things inside the cabin itself that were impossible. The gentle drip of water in a drought, the faint rustle of dry leaves on his wooden floor, even when no windows were open. He tried to ignore it, to focus on his writing, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers trembled over the keyboard, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and paranoia. He found himself whispering to himself, a desperate attempt to fill the void, to ground himself in reality. The silence, however, was stronger. It absorbed his voice, swallowed his thoughts, leaving him adrift in a sea of escalating terror. The old, weathered wood of the cabin seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored his own frantic heartbeat. And as the days turned into weeks, the solitude that he had once craved transformed into an unbearable torture. an eternal torment where the only company was the relentless, encroaching darkness, and the chilling certainty that the forest, the cabin, and whatever ancient thing resided within them were slowly, systematically consuming him, piece by agonizing piece. The crescendo of David's horror came one particularly still night. The usual sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, had vanished, replaced by that deep, pervasive silence. It was the kind of silence that vibrated in your teeth, a vacuum that sucked all comfort from the air. He was trying to write, hunched over his laptop, when the cabin's internal temperature plummeted, exhaling a breath of icy, primordial cold that brought goosebumps to his skin despite the fire roaring in the hearth. The shadows in the room elongated, deepening to an impossible black, seeming to detach themselves from their sources and drift freely, coiling around the furniture, around him. Then the trees. Through his window he saw them. The ancient redwoods just beyond his clearing began to sway, not in the wind, but with a slow, deliberate, almost sentient motion, their gnarled branches reaching towards his cabin like skeletal, grasping arms. The scratching, which had been a faint background hum, intensified from inside his walls, escalating into a furious, relentless tearing, as if something gargantuan was trying to claw its way out from the very structure of the cabin. Splinters of wood began to rain down from the ceiling, small cracks spider-webbing across the plaster. But the true horror was when the ancient symbols he'd seen carved on the trees outside began to glow faintly, etched into the very grain of his wooden walls. They pulsed with a dim, phosphorescent light, expanding and contracting with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a monstrous heart. As they pulsed, a low, guttural chanting began to emanate from the walls themselves, a chorus of deep, resonant voices that were not human, not animal, but something far, far older, something that spoke of primordial dread and forgotten rituals. The air grew thick with the scent of pine needles and ozone, a sickly sweet smell of decay and raw power. The cabin began to shudder, vibrating violently, and David instinctively knew it was not an earthquake. This was something else. Something alive. The ceiling above him began to buckle, groaning under an unseen weight, and a dark, viscous liquid, smelling faintly of stagnant water and something metallic, began to seep through the cracks, dripping onto his desk, onto his hands. He looked down at the liquid, seeing vague, shifting shapes within its depths, as if something ancient and malevolent was swimming just beneath the surface. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His vocal cords were paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated terror. He could only watch as the entire cabin seemed to fold in on itself, the glowing symbols on the walls intensifying their light until they were blinding, the chanting swelling into a deafening roar that filled his very mind, threatening to shatter his sanity. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a blinding white flash and an unimaginable, crushing pressure was his own reflection in the window, stretched and distorted beyond recognition, its mouth open in a silent, eternally terrified scream, as the ancient forest outside seemed to lean in, its branches weaving together, forming a solid, impenetrable wall around his doomed sanctuary. The implication was clear. The cabin wasn't just being destroyed, it was being consumed, devoured by the very entity that had been watching him, waiting for the opportune moment to manifest its ancient, insatiable hunger. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything before, swallowing the last vestiges of his existence, leaving only the chilling echo of his silent scream in the profound, consuming darkness of the forest. These stories, from Sarah's invisible touch to Mark and Emily's malevolent home and David's consumption by the ancient forest, all weave a common thread: the profound and terrifying vulnerability of being truly alone in what should be your safest space. They highlight how easily the mind can be twisted by fear, how perception can betray us, and how the insidious nature of an unknown, inexplicable threat can chip away at sanity until nothing is left but hollowed-out despair. It's the terrifying realization that some horrors don't need a masked assailant or a blood-soaked knife. They only need the quiet, the darkness, and the chilling certainty that you are not, in fact, alone. The deepest fear isn't of what you can see but of what you can't, of the unseen presence that breathes down your neck, the spectral eyes that track your every move, the insidious whispers that slowly, inexorably drive you to the brink. These aren't just tales of the supernatural. They're psychological portraits of minds under siege, of individuals pushed beyond their limits by the relentless, ambiguous horror that has breached the sanctity of their homes. They force us to confront the unnerving possibility that the places we inhabit, the spaces we call our own, might harbor secrets far older and more malevolent than we could ever comprehend. So, have you ever felt that chilling presence? That unshakable certainty that something else is in the room just out of sight? If these stories send shivers down your spine, If they made you glance over your shoulder, then perhaps you understand the true nature of terror. We want to hear your experiences. Have you ever felt truly alone only to realize you weren't? Share your own chilling encounters in the comments below. We'd love to hear them and perhaps even feature them in a future video. And if you're brave enough for more spine-chilling tales, be sure to check out our other videos right here on the channel. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more terrifying true stories that will keep you up at night. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.